Is my soothing voice a medication? Are we just addressing the symptoms? How do we turn from a model of correct or remedy-based treatment to a preventative and holistic approach to healing this body? The bodies of discarded individuals, the body of ill organizations, and the body of other suffering large structures that transpose their own suffering onto others' bodies. Again, from Google, going back. I like the internet. Equity is also a branch of law that was developed alongside common law in order to remedy some of its defects in fairness and justice, formerly administered in special courts. Is remedy possible? Or true, if this happens again and again and again, is inclusion based on identity authentic or sincere? Does it lead to authentic or sincere and systemic change? C, affirmative action in all extenuating arguments and stances. C, oh, Amina, it's impossible to get into X residency nowadays if you are white and not making work about identity. C, a quote from a white colleague of mine on a residency I attended. Is your inclusion working if the validity of my work is questioned? If the validity of my presence is doubted? If every white face scans the room when I'm at a meeting and not so secretly wonders if I am only there because I am Black, femme, and queer? Am I included if not so secretly I am not wanted, and if my presence cannot be sustained? Financially, mentally, and emotionally? Am I included if the people I share a room with would rather see me dead or refuse to acknowledge that we're dying? Is this a corrective panel? What is ever an adequate remedy? And is my soothing voice a medication? I wonder, some questions, you know. My name's Amina, I'm a creator, I make things. I'm undisciplined, I like to throw stones, shake things up, that's kind of my thing. I work across mediums, shaping spaces that are dedicated to darkness and love. Sometimes that's through language and light in the form of video installations, and other times that exists maybe more practically or materially through organizing workshops. Right now, a lot of my love and labor has been based in education and shaping intentional educational spaces, one of which is through Beauty Breaks, which is a workshop series for and by Black women and Black people along a broad spectrum of femininity. And I also work as a co-lead artist to TCA, Teen Creative Agency, at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and with a teen program at Hyde Park Art Center. So that's that.
When I was 16 years old, living in California with my family, it was my first time coming to the U.S. I had previously I was born in the Philippines and lived in Japan with my adoptive family. My dad was in the Navy at the time. So in California, having arrived from these spaces where I saw my reflection, I saw communities around me, and then it's supplanted or implanted now into this gigantic world, this new country where I couldn't see myself anywhere. And still carrying with me this need to create, this need to express myself. My mom told me, Filipinos don't belong on stage, they are in the background. And this stuck with me, and this hit me so hard because I knew that that wasn't true. I knew from my own identity, from my own internal being, that that was not true. And at that age, when I questioned my mother about this very belief that she carried, that was influenced, that was foisted on her, that she took with her through immigration and through crossing borders, I realized then and there that this was a responsibility that I had. And so, in thinking about equity, I have to think also about the necessity for the movement to really come from an internal space and an internal awakened state of necessary motion. And that's how I think about what drives me, what drives my work, what drives just existing and communicating and interacting and sharing with others. I make my work through many disciplines, and it can look like a performance, it can look like a dance or a sculpture or something in between, and something that changes from one form to another. And that's how I see myself, that's how I live my life, that's how I see myself reflected in the people around me as well. Coming from that internal state of necessity, of existing, of expressing, and then sharing that. And then hoping that, maybe not hoping, but making it necessary that the way is paved, or that, and if it's not paved, then I will do that work to pave that road. So, here we are.
Hello. So for like 10 plus years, I did direct service work, both here in Chicago and nationally, working with people living with AIDS and HIV, specifically around Black folks living with HIV and AIDS around the country, and low-income folks, drug users, formerly homeless folks. I ran a needle exchange program in Brooklyn for many years and worked with those with the least amongst us in order to build capacity for them to advocate for their own rights and needs, and for that not to be stated by an outside entity. That work literally drove me crazy and made me like really angry and intense inside because I didn't know how to leave it at home because my identity was so closely linked to the work that I was carrying out every day. Once that decision had hit me and that was becoming a real reality in my life, I made the decision to then make art because I needed to somehow continue to respond back to what was happening in the world, but by putting beauty, or what I identify as being beauty, back into it. So that's currently kind of somewhat where my process sits. But also a part of my HIV and AIDS work and part of my current work is around direct action, specifically as a tool in the toolbox towards organizing in all sorts of arenas. I originally found out about this exhibition because I got a call from Christopher Paul Jordan, who is a member of the Tacoma Action Council. And he was put in touch with me because of my national work and my direct action work, and specifically what they had done there in that museum. And so he's been generous enough throughout this year or so as this has gone on to continue to be in conversation with me around what it means to shape this frame about our identities within this museum context. I can relate somewhat from what he's told me that, you know, it was fine to have these new iterations of the exhibition as they exist, and I'm very happy to know that in my hometown of Chicago, it's living in its best truth, I find. And that feels really good, that thoughtfulness is coming along, and that's becoming aligned with what's happening. I do think we have to start, though, at the impetus that, and I'm gonna be a little flagrant right now, that two white cis men can sit and decide that they're going to decide what an entire retrospective of disease that killed a good majority of my people looks like, and that you could do that with such hubris and not really see what the problem was is the problem, right? We are sitting in these spaces that were never ours to begin with, discussing in canons that were never ours to begin with. So in the context of when we talk about how do we change institutions, in my activist mind, I say, don't change them, blow them up, because they don't make any sense. They were never made for us to exist in, and they're actually almost made to kill us, right? And to kill our expressive bodies and our experiences. I'm currently in a graduate program in school and navigating that space around being a Black maker and having your voice be yours and still not looked upon as being, stepping outside of that frame is still a difficult process because we're still talking about a book that was never written to include varied voices. And so, yeah.
Thank you all for your opening comments. There's a lot to talk about. I want to go back to where Chris began with telling us about the controversy over the first iteration of this exhibition. I want to ask Tony if you could talk a little bit about how the show is different in Chicago than it was in its previous iteration, and why.
Well, first, of course, your points are well taken. It occurred to us too about how this show came to be, but it was not. So it is the show that it was, plus things that we've done to it. We didn't start all over and make a new show, but we did add. We worked very hard to find additional works that would help round out the story in a way that the original project where it had fallen short. And one of the most powerful works for me in the show is one that we added here, the Howardina Bindell work here on the wall. It's called Separate But Equal Genocide/AIDS. And if you should take a close look at it, because at first it looks like it's in a way like the AIDS quilt and has names on it of people one imagines passed away thanks to the AIDS crisis. But if you then look at what's in the red borders, you'll see that there are a great many other sins of government, either sins that were tolerated or sins that were perpetrated by government, and that also are responsible for many people's deaths. And it then becomes much less clear that all the names there are referring solely to AIDS. So it's a work that speaks to a great many ills, not simply just to say, oh yes, we've managed to find a work by an African-American woman. There are works by Chicago artists that tell, I think, a story about life in Chicago and the way it was being lived. The work of Patrick McCoy, a photographer and a collector in town who lives on the South Side. His work is up over here, quilt, and I think we wanted to add works. We have videos. We have works that, as I say, where we were trying to round out the story that the original exhibition told. Did we have many more artists of color in the show now than was true in the past? The show is actually bigger here, includes more works altogether than it did anywhere else. Did we solve the fundamental problem about this exhibition? No. And I think there was that. That is for what the next project should be. Rather than grafting onto a project, that we start over and think again about how a project like this can do something more than this project was able to do.
I want to follow up a little bit with you, and not to put you on the spot, but can you talk a little bit about the curatorial process here in Chicago? Who was involved? If you look at the surveys of the current state of the field, curatorial is the most white of all the job titles in art institutions and museums. And so, you're one of them. What are some ways that you find that you can bring other voices to the table in your curatorial process, or is that something that you think is important for your own process?
I do think it's important, and I don't think I did well enough. One artist who worked with us, and in fact was responsible for finding the Howardina Bindell, John Neff, some of you might know him, great fellow, white, he's white, but he also spent a lot of time talking to people like Patrick McCoy and Israel Wright here in Chicago to think about how, who were the people, who was doing this work, where can we find things. We've got work by Michael Qualls, which is actually from Patrick's collection, an artist who was gay and HIV positive and was not comfortable talking about that in public. There are artists who are not included in the show because their families are still uncomfortable with the truth about their sexuality and about their diagnosis. And so we struggled with some of those issues. But it would have been great if there had been more time, and if I had simply been better informed, where to find people in town who could help speak to the art of the period, thinking back to the 1980s and the 1990s, who could have talked about what was happening. I will say one other thing, which is really sort of structural about how the way the curators thought about the show initially, and that reflects the problem that institutions have, and that is that they wanted originally to have a subtitle for the show, How AIDS Changed American Art. And they thought of it as a historical exhibition that really focused on the 1980s and the 1990s. So they felt they wanted to talk about the artists who were most important. Well, who were the artists who were talked about in most of the books? White men. And so where are those other artists? What happened? And I know from work that we did at the Smart Museum that a lot of artists recognized that they were not, artists of color, recognized that they were not going to be successful in the standard museum and gallery system. They weren't going to find success going through the normal channels. And then they chose alternative means of distributing their work and of seeing one another's works. But they didn't make it into the system. And they aren't as fully represented in collections, and they don't appear in the histories. And then people say, well, we wanted to talk about the ones who were important, and too bad there weren't any. And it's just not true, but it does speak to the challenge that history presents us in the way some of those artists were operating, and that they weren't part of the system, and thus it continues on generation after generation that they seem not to appear in the way that they should.
Thank you. I want to get the makers on the panel involved in this conversation and follow up on something that Charles said. What do you think is the role of the artist or the maker in blowing up institutions or systems or challenging some of the problems that we're talking about tonight?
Well, I think that sometimes people let artists get away with saying things that administrators may be a bit too shy to say. And I think that as someone who works between, I curate things, I'm also working in the education department of the MCA, and I'm an artist, wanting to maintain that power and freedom that maybe I invented, but maintaining that and occupying that space of being vocal just as the most basic step in those environments and not feeling like I have to shut up for anybody, I think is really important. And also going back to what Amar said earlier, we are cultural producers, and in making objects or making spaces, when we do have resources that are going into that, treating the work that I'm doing as a way to open up avenues, lend a hand, extend myself to other people is the second way that, on the day-to-day and my everyday, that I bring that to the table. Yeah.
I think the moment right now for me calls really for us to all be doing a lot more political education. And in this context, I think we need to be doing political art education, right? So we're taught this one history that exists as art history, but all of our peoples had histories of making that were happening throughout time. There was not a silence of creation. And so we need to rediscover what those were and look at them and really analyze them so that when we're creating new things, we have that same sense of grounding that comes from having historical backing. And until we really begin to do that work, I think we talk about it a lot, and we refer to things, and we all need to be encouraging one another, actually creating events in which we are unearthing our art histories, right? The alternative histories, and bringing those to bear, and within our own grasp, and not kind of taught to us by, the anthropologist from UIC, very well intentioned, but however not from us and of us, and so isn't looking at it with the same vigor and hope.
So thinking about my role as an artist, I really connect that also to the role a shaman, of a witch, of, you know, of the storyteller. And that's a responsibility that I carry and that I take seriously. And I think it starts from that, right? And as you were saying also, going back to and learning about the histories that are often hidden from us, or that have been taken away, or that have been taken apart and put in a museum outside of the reach of the people who it's supposed to be illustrating. For me, it's about saying, I have a right to that, and then following through with that. And it's that following through that is often difficult, right? But if we take that responsibility seriously, then the action has to follow. And that can look like many different things, and it changes every day. I think as an artist, working in institutions and outside of institutions and in response to institutions, or even apart from institutions, what I try to do is go about all of those paths at the same time, because that's how I see it, as exploding that structure by making it obsolete and making something new.
I think history is important and political education is important. I think there's also a very kind of mundane, more immediate thing that curators can do and institutions can do, which is just surround yourself with people who are like diverse, and like go out into community and hang out with them. I mean, like almost everyone that is involved with Open TV, you know, I met at like a party in Pilsen or Chance's Dances, or, you know, like at Party Noir or whatever, and like that's how you meet people, and then those people know people, and you see their art in different contexts, and they tell you about shows, and like that's how you actually diversify. It's like in Hollywood, the people who are writing on shows just like hang out with the other people who are writing on shows, and that's why show staffs are not diverse, because they hire who they're comfortable with and who they know. So I think like history is a problem because people who write histories are generally speaking white men, but also like we do live in Chicago, which as Chris showed is like one of the most diverse cities in the country. So like there are folks around us. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to keep going with this idea of unearthing our histories or traditions within other communities. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to comment on the role of social media and the internet in helping to spread these kind of alternative histories, to create an audience for alternative histories. And I'm thinking of, you know, like folks on Instagram, I think it's at Museum Mammy, who, you know, lets us know what's going on in the Black art world, et cetera. So does anybody want to comment on that?
I guess I'll start since I have the mic. Yeah, I think there's lots of possibilities on the internet. I find that teaching students, some people just don't know, right? So I do have Black contemporary art on a syllabus this quarter to like spread the word. And there's lots of really great, interesting videos like that circulate on Facebook. Like I know there's a Black web TV, Black queer TV network, Slay, that's been doing these cute little videos of like voguing history and whatnot. So I think people are starting to realize the value of telling undertold histories, but I do think it's a challenge that all these social media networks are corporate, and the algorithm are structured in a way to not necessarily give you things that are educational or informative, but oftentimes things that are not, or things that just get lots of clicks because they make people mad, or they produce a kind of effective response that's immediate and causes people to share or like or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's an equal playing ground, right? And something that exists outside of or within this larger kind of capitalist context, but that we can also change to make our own thing out of. And so there's a lot of power in that. I do think that there is a need for us to be having conversations, though, right? And so like we need to be distilling it from that space into actual this kind of dialoguing and like talking amongst ourselves. I think I'm missing the jump from there, the bridge that exists, and I'd love to see more development around that. How are we as makers jumping that bridge from being kind of like buddies to like solid partners and just deconstruction of the world.
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, the word of bridge, like moving it from this sort of virtual, very ephemeral space as well, like to this a sort of more maybe flesh and blood is what I've been talking about a lot. I don't know how appealing that sounds to most people, but I like it. But to sort of like a flesh and blood sort of material space, I think is important. And what I like about your work a lot, Amar, like what you just mentioned, that process of putting a link in your syllabus or bringing it up in conversation, and in a classroom, that's a space to unpack that more and sort of developing archives. Like one thing that I'm not on social media, so that's one thing. But I definitely love the internet and I'm aware of it and really interested in the way that these communities form. But I do think that the ephemerality of the information and of the videos, like has anyone tried to trace a video and you can never find the origin, right? Or like you can't find who made it, and then, or has anyone tried a link and then it disappears? Like that, I think, is something that is maybe even potentially dangerous about new internet, and why I think that like, even if we're having ephemeral lived experiences, that memory can like live within ourselves and be passed on through oral histories. Like, I think that creating a bridge between that space and this space is important. And so I think the work of educators, which has come up a few times already, is like really vital.
I really think about my interaction with the internet, or specifically social media, as a thing that augments my reality rather than really kind of dictating what it is. And in that way, that's kind of how I bridge these worlds. I use that as the gateway, or really just as a poster that tells me where to go. The interaction itself happens face to face. It happens body to body, flesh and blood. And I think that's when and how the strongest kind of energetic exchange really happens. Do we get that through the internet? Yeah, I think we do, and I think we do have these little windows into other people's lives, and as artists, we can definitely use these as tools to really fully illustrate or really have another kind of lens onto our practice or into our processes, and then seeing that reflected with how other people use it as well creates this web exchange. But it ends to a point where then, yeah, the flesh and the blood and the real has to be bridged, has to be navigated still, and I think that's where the most fruitful changes do take place. So.
Thank you. Can any of you talk about, this exhibition changed because of an intervention by activists. So can any of you talk about either personal experiences you've had or that you know of where artists and activists have successfully intervened around issues of equity and inclusion in the art world or museum world?
I think that's something, and this ties into what we were just talking about, the social media. That's the only reason I know about it, but Black women artists with Black Lives right now, which was started by Simone Lee and a bunch of other Black women artists in New York right now, is just really popping. It's really amazing to watch these women both celebrate and in the museum context really kick up the heels around representation and identity. And to me, that isn't tying yourself or locking down to something, but the intervention of inserting their bodies in the space is tremendously important and valuable. And that in and of itself is an act, a direct action in insertion into the dialogue conversation.
I don't know much about successful or prominent actions in the art world, though I do know that there's a lot happening in Boyle Heights right now in LA. I don't know how much progress they're making because it seems like there's a backlash, but it's around gentrification and the installation of galleries that don't serve the community there, so folks should Google that. I think Hyperallergic has been very on top of it. But I can say in television, there's a really interesting tale that not a lot of people know about, where in 1999, the NAACP protested what was then an all-white broadcast television season, 3 years after the passage of the Telecommunications Act in 1996. television networks vertically integrated, and it made it very difficult for what was then a very bustling black TV sphere in the 1990s. All those producers couldn't get meetings all of a sudden, and those shows quickly died. And the outgrowth of that protest was the creation of network diversity writing programs. So like ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC all have these programs that are designed to get minority writers into writers' rooms. And they're still around today. But interestingly enough, they haven't really changed issues of equity. And I think it goes back to what happened after Tacoma, where that action was successful in bringing in artists of color, but it didn't create structural change, right? And in television, what happened was that those writers became the network people on writing staff. So they were the people that, like, the white executive producers didn't want to hire, but had to hire. So they were in the room, right, but they didn't have power in the room. And I think it's an important part of, like, when we do our actions, we have to be very specific about what we want. And we should always ask for power, right? We should always ask for hiring power.
So I'm gonna open it up to the audience now to see if anybody has comments or questions that they'd like to get in on the conversation. Is there an audience mic, or am I Oprah?
I have a question. Hi. So, because the conversation is around equity, right, and I think a number of people sort of talked about the question or the reality of resources, I'm interested in to what extent is a conversation about equity really a conversation around resources, who has it, who gets to deploy it, and how we get more of it. Because I think, to me, when I think of equity, even in my own work, that's what we're talking about, right? How do we open up access to resources, which also reads as power, I think, in a way.
Yeah, I'm interested in that question because I think, like, where my mind may initially go first and maybe other people's minds is money. And I think in my own practice, it's been trying to think of knowledge. And you mentioned earlier mentor networks and things like that being barriers to equity. Like the way that knowledge and the sharing of information through, like, educational outlets is a real material resource. And I think something that is abundant in many of our communities but underutilized, like even if that's like I don't know, a plug for a good tax man who can tell you, like, the artist write-offs for your taxes that you need. Like how that's something that's a bit, see, the artists who have good taxes, we're snapping. I'm gonna hit you up after this because that's what I'm looking for. But the way that information and knowledge and these conversations, like, are so valuable. This is how, like, people who have power stay in power, and people who are rich continue to have money. Like, why, you know, like, it's because a lot of information and, like, little put-ons like that are kept secret. So that's kind of in my own artistic, educational, whatever you want to call it, practice that I've been doing, is trying to figure out how I can get more people who need to be in a room together to swap the right plugs, basically, you know?
I agree. It is about power and money, and I think, you know, what the case that I'm trying to make is, when you look at the history of art and culture, the folks who actually drive innovation are the folks who are historically excluded. And I think the people in power, like the board members, like the donors, need to realize that actually by investing in those people that you haven't been investing in, that's what's going to make your institution relevant and transformative. And it does go to, like, paying them something that they can actually live on.
I just want to endorse that. Because it's been one of the most frustrating elements of working inside these institutions and hoping they can change. It wasn't our mission to blow them up, you know. But working inside them and seeing the same mistakes, the same habits over and over and over again, and the same wish, maybe we could get that guy to join our board. The same guy who's on every board in town. The one person who seems acceptable. Because you understand, for the board, we need to have people who have the resources to contribute, not recognizing that there are other kinds of resources that people can contribute that are equally important. It keeps happening. And so it's really important that the pressure stays on, and that the recognition that, institutions like museums, like symphonies, like a lot of theater companies will not exist in the future when they are catering to an ever smaller portion of the American population. But you just have to keep pushing, because inside the institutions, it's really hard you constantly feel like you're pushing the ball uphill.
Hello. So I think that, like, I definitely hear what you're saying, right? And I think about, I used to work for an organization that put stories on NPR. And I think, like, in that space, in, like, the context of that space, it's like, even, like, a tiny, like, one story from someone who's, like, not white, middle-class America is, like, lauded, is like, oh my God, this is so diverse, this is amazing, right? And then it's like, okay, so then I think it creates this incentive structure, right? Where it's like, well, we don't really need a lot, we don't need 33% of Black stories on the radio. That's too much. We only need like a handful, and then we meet our quota, and then we're good, and then we can keep getting money to progress so incrementally towards this goal, right, of actually being like equitable. So I guess my question is like, what incentive structures do you feel like need to be in place for institutions to be authentically sincerely representative? And then secondly, what is the accountability? Like, because I think that's, right, what you're talking about, we talk, but we don't do anything. Like, what would it mean to be actually accountable, for these institutions to be accountable to us and to our communities?
I'll just relay one strategy I heard at a conference, and I think the fellow was the former president of the Minnesota Science Center, and he's white. But he said we had to find a way to make our staff more inclusive. And so he would insist that when the managers in the department, the supervisors within the museum were hiring, they had to explain at every step how they narrowed the field from the largest pool to the finalists, and if they did not hire the candidate of color, then they had to explain that too. Why did you choose, if you had good finalist candidates, why did you not choose? You had to have a finalist who was of color, and then he said, and then if you didn't hire that person, you had to explain why. And he said, no, none of the supervisors wanted to have that conversation more than once. Now, it might seem like a rather crude way of going about it, but it did create significant change in terms of who was on the staff of his institution. And those people then began to have power within that institution. They had roles, they controlled some of the money, and that really changed the direction of the institution. So that's not by any means a perfect method, but understanding that you have to keep insisting, and you have to insist that everyone in the organization is out looking for candidates, is out thinking about who should be represented on the board, on the staff, and that you don't settle just saying, well, we looked and we didn't find anybody. That's not a good enough answer.
I think that also, like, we have to really start to redevelop what we think of as being resources, right? Like, kind of information exchange is also a resource. And also, there are hella brown people with money, right? Like, so let's stop acting like we're, like, out here, like, not getting capitalist gains, because we're not, I'm not, but there are hella I mean, but, like, so, like, let's, like, I mean, we have to really, and so we have to be, how are we organizing that donor base? How are we creating entirely new institutions? And so when I say blow up, I do not mean, like, literally that kind of situation, but I mean deconstruct and build anew. But because we're talking about where are our funds at? And if you're like, Dusabo just got Chance on as their board director. That's like, I don't know what that means. I don't know if Chance was like a super art philanthropist person, but whatever. He has money, he knows other brown people with money. Start bringing those people to the table to talk about it. And then you don't have to have these explanational programs that go in and try to get people to not see their fucked upness. Like, you could just skip that step because they've experienced it, so they have it in their hand, And so, like, I think let's start to think about things in that way.
Hey, thank you for a fantastic conversation so far. So quite early on in my activism, social justice life, and quite early on in my arts life, I was given a mantra by a number of people, And it was either you work outside the system or you work inside the system. And I know that the folks on this panel, just by the stuff that you've been talking about and the way that you've been talking about it, and also through following your work, though, or in spite of, or along with having anti-establishment, anti-capitalist streaks, you're all working inside the system. You're all working with institutions. I know that that like itches, and I know that that's tough, and I can't imagine as you sort of move higher in the ladder how much more tough it is to reconcile those feelings. So my question is there a way for us to, the word equity itself is very coded as an institutional thing. We talk about equity when we talk about institutions. When we say equity, we mean big white buildings made by white people, right? So how do we, is there a way to talk about the philosophy of equity in an extra institutional sense? Is there a way to talk about the philosophy of equity that puts at the forefront the people who are never going to walk into Art AIDS America Chicago, no matter how diverse it is? Yeah.
So I guess the question is, like, we've been mainly talking about equity in institutions. What about equity outside of institutions? I'm grossly summarizing. That was beautiful, but okay. Yeah, I think equity outside of institutions feels like, I don't want to say easy, like it's not completely easy, but when you're not navigating, like, sometimes depending on how old the institution is, hundreds of years of like fucked up baggage, pardon my language. Like, it's easier in my attic, like I have my workshops in my attic, alternative spaces, like we're all working, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have worked in DIY alternative spaces. You see sometimes these like incredibly beautiful, transformative moments, and even extending beyond moments into full programming that allows for wonderful, almost like utopic, like, you know, exchanges between people. Those things are less visible though, right? Like, a lot of the wonderful moments that I'm sure we've all been a part of in these art spaces are way less visible, not talked about. The histories are not written, they're not recorded, files get lost, people get evicted. Like, that's the tragedy of this. I mean, I've been evicted. Like, I've been kicked out of my DIY spaces. It happens, right? And they erase us, but we are here. And I think that if we had, like, you know, a cool share out of all the awesome times in attics and basements and apartments, you know, squats and places you're not supposed to be, we could do that for days, and that would also be beautiful. Yeah, but I think that one of the things when I was like thinking about this panel about institutions in particular is that a lot of these large white cubes have such a heavy hand that I do think a transformation of the way that museums and galleries and these large art structures are working is important. And to blow them up in whatever way, you know, with different people who have different methods, is important because they do have such a heavy hand, large impressions in the spaces that they exist in, and a wide reach, and large amounts of resources, whether it be capital or information, or even the ability to sustain keeping a space, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think what I really admire about a lot of us on this panel and about a lot of wonderful cultural workers in Chicago is the ability to exist in and out. Yeah.
Something I think about with regards to equity and institutions particularly is that institutions are not just these buildings, right? There are humans there. There are people there that you make eye contact with and that you actually exchange a conversation with, and that's how things happen, by honoring that that's another human being there with just as a complex of a history as you do. And I think when both sides see that, then the walls aren't there anymore. At least that's like how I like to think about it. Maybe that's a little utopic, maybe that's whatever else, but you can't deny that that's real. That's a human being in front of you. Or on the other side of that email. So yeah, I don't know. I think it just, for me, it just begins there by knowing that it's not just you're not just talking to a block, and a block isn't just talking to you. There's an exchange, and whatever gets exchanged there has to be fruitful, or what else are you doing it for?
I agree completely with that, and I just want to say I think it's really important. We can't just depend on institutions and the people within them who have been formed within and by those institutions to just say, today we're going to think entirely differently about everything. Today we'll include new people. We're open to ideas that yesterday we weren't open to. It's a power of imagination and self-confidence. If people can imagine themselves in those institutions, if they can imagine themselves leading those institutions and being board members. If Chance had thought that he wasn't, I mean, he's not, you know, he's too young to be a typical board member. He's too black to be a typical board member. But he was asked to be a board member and he said yes. And part of it is about that. You've got to believe in yourself that you can do this, that you belong there as much as anybody else, that you understand what it takes to make that institution stronger and better, and that's how those institutions will get stronger. It doesn't happen, it will never happen if you just hope that the institution itself is going to suddenly wake up and be different. They move much too slowly, and it's about recognizing that the power is in the people who are going to make those changes. They're the ones who need to be able to see it and do it.
I mean, I don't really think you can have equity with institutions. I don't know. I mean, like, I've been in institutions my whole life. My whole project is like taking money from institutions and giving them to queer people of color. And like, you know, the institution doesn't really like that. You know, they'd rather I like, you know, do the institutional thing. I think institutions recognize other institutions. Like, when I had on my CV that we did Kiam's premiere for Nupino Obama at 1618, which was like so awesome, and that DIY space has like so many amazing art events that a museum would kill to have. My like dean didn't care when I said that we were premiering our second cycle at the MCA. She was like, oh, that's great. And I'm like, how do you think I got to the MCA? By like doing DIY stuff and like building a community. So I'm very cynical about institutions, but I am committed to doing both, right? Like bridging, trying to create bridges to them. I just think it's gonna take some kind of social shock, really, to like shake everything up and break everything down. Right? I think it might be coming. I don't know.
Well, I'd like the audience to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And again, thanking Chris and Alpha Woods for inviting us all here into this space and to see this wonderful exhibition.
I just want to wrap up by giving a little background on Enrich Chicago. 3 years ago, a group of Chicago arts leaders formed after the release of AFTA's Americans for the Arts, that's the acronym AFTA, demographic survey about arts administrators, which revealed that 92% of all art executive directors were Caucasian and 86% of all administrators were Caucasian. Enrich Chicago works to increase funding to ALANA, it's another acronym standing for African, Latino, Asian, Arab, Native American organizations, increase funding to ALANA organizations, increase support for ALANA artists, increase support for ALANA administrators. Another aspect, central aspect of Enrich Chicago is undoing racism trainings led by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Quick glance here at some of the organizations that are participating in this. Movements are happening, movements are underway. This is just another example of how some institutions and people are coming together and dealing with embracing equity. I loved the conversation tonight. It's challenging, it was jarring a little bit in some ways, and that's what we wanted to do. And that's why we bring together artists to talk. And so thank you guys for your candid conversation. In my short experience as an arts professional, one of the things that I notice and I see at conferences is too often the left, too often the artists, the liberals are fighting at each other. And I'm calling on each of you today as you're here and we're all on the same team working together to make sure that we continue to work together. Coming of Age by Brad Johnson. We stand here listening and are aware of the night as it awakens in us the remembrance of dreaming. Earlier this day when the birds in our woods signaled and our eyes open and our nostrils to twitch from the seeing of first inhalations. Some birds do indeed sing through the night of all we can remember, temperature gaugings at the site of our earliest emergence, revealing that all was cool then, after the fire of our Earth's displacements and the cathartic pains that grew from our hairy backs. Now we attempt to stand upright, our fingers craving the touch of skies and the tops of trees as we climb, scarring thighs to witness the birth of suns and revel in that heaven, in our mind that seeks to reveal itself to us in all its brilliance during the multitudinous writhings of whatever metamorphic pilgrimage we must make during this era of darkness and human folly. We must emerge again as warriors and wage a battle of love as the legacy of those birds in our woods and to ourselves. Thank you.